I was first sent to the Chernobyl zone in 1990, so 4 years after the tragedy at the Chernobyl nuclear plant. My city in Scotland had decided to twin, which has become Город Побратим, of Гомель in Belarus, without realizing A, that it was not in Russia, and B, they had no idea that it was right bang in the center of one of the two areas most impacted by radiation. We developed this relationship by accident, and I'm so glad that it happened, because a lot of these arrangements can be ceremonial. For us, it provided an impetus for people to get involved who normally would not have got involved. So scientists, medics, people interested in how the community was coping. And I went into the contaminated zone. I speak Russian, and I wasn't a scientist or anything, so I kind of slipped under the radar from the authorities. So I was free really to gain access to people and places that those, say, nuclear physicists who came in a couple of years later, they didn't have the access that I did. I don't claim to have scientific knowledge, nor am I a medic. But what interested me was the human impact, which is why I get a lot from the writing of Svetlana Alexievich, and her reflections are very similar to mine.
Жыве Беларусь! Жыве Беларусь! Жыве Беларусь! Жыве Беларусь! Жыве Беларусь! Жыве Беларусь! Remember Chernobyl and never again! Remember Chernobyl and never again!
I was aware of the secrecy, I was aware of the lack of trust in official information, that people were not ready to trust anything, even when areas were safe. They didn't trust a word that the authorities were saying, and no wonder, because the whole thing was covered up. I remember very clearly being told they got the sheep out before the people, which showed the priorities of the regime at the time, headed by Gorbachev, who was saying the right things about transparency, glasnost, but the system was entrenched in the old ways, and one could argue that Belarus has remained like that. So I went to a village that, according to the official statistics, had been evacuated. Now, while there may have been a stamp on a document that said this village has been evacuated, the reality was that they had not been evacuated. They'd closed all the shops, they'd closed all the services, but the people were there. 4 years later, all their belongings on the back of trucks, just waiting. I still have a sense of Belarusians waiting, just waiting, patiently waiting for something to happen, and it never seems to happen. I spoke to an old lady there, and she must have been 80, and she said, I was digging up potatoes during the war with my bare hands. But then I knew what I was fighting against. I could see the enemy, and I can't see that now. Another impression was an orphanage that I went to. Now, that orphanage had been connected with tragedy after World War II. There was a concentration camp nearby, and they took in those children who had been experimented on to this Dom Rybionek in Homel region. And they showed me the register of the children from those days. Sasha, they gave them Russian names because those children were nameless. Sasha lived for 4 days, Misha lived for 7 days, etc. And it struck me that this was a building that had always been connected with the suffering of children. After Chernobyl, they were taking in children with deformities, birth defects, and those women in that orphanage were not being paid. Belarus had run out of money to pay their salaries, and they were still going in there. That is the spirit of Belarus. Dare I say specifically Belarusian women who are now at the forefront of change of what's going on currently. I knew from the start that the process of change would be led by strong women finally finding their voice, because they have come from very strong parents and grandparents.
We will continue to fight for the human rights of all Belarusians, of all ages.
I'm incredibly proud of my time in the zone and what I'm doing now here today.